Good morning. Welcome to, hard to believe, we are on lesson 20 of understanding and exploring LDS history, where I'm doing my very best. I say this every week. I'm doing my very best, even though we will disagree with our LDS friends in our community. We'll disagree on a great number of areas. Our intent in this is not to be disagreeable and not to disagree for the sake of disagreeing, but rather just to go back and look at the history of the church and take an honest look at what history actually says happened. What we want to get to more than anything is to get to the truth. Bobby talked this morning. If you were in first service, we looked at Acts chapter 6 and Stephen's trial before the Sanhedrin. And so many lessons there that I hope I can draw from in this class, where Stephen, who even though he disagreed with the leaders at the time, was so gracious and so kind that when they looked on him, they said he had the face of an angel. And I don't think anybody will ever say that about me. But I hope I can at least be gracious and kind as we go through this together. We left off last week in the spring of 1833, where we have the saints now. They are settled in Missouri, and what they believe is going to be Zion. And the bulk of the church is there, with new converts coming in every day into Missouri. But you also have the branch of the church up in Kirtland, where a lot of the leadership is, and where Joseph Smith is. And that's kind of where we left things last week. Then in the spring of 1833, in Kirtland, Smith began an active campaign to try and build a temple in Kirtland, Ohio. And a revelation dictated it would be 55 by 65 and 3 stories tall. And that doesn't sound like a massive building in our day and age, but in that part of the world and in that day and time, that was a much more imposing structure than the average frontier church that you saw built. It was a pretty massive undertaking at the time, and what they were eventually able to build is actually quite impressive for the time period, and it's still there today, and we'll get to all of that eventually. But it was a pretty ambitious building project. And this was the original revelation in January of 1833, commanding them to build this. Organize yourselves, prepare every needful thing, and establish a house. And notice house in this over and over again. Establish a house, even a house of prayer, and a house of fasting, and a house of faith, a house of learning, a house of glory, a house of order, a house of God. Because Smith had to be very careful here in not calling it, at least originally, he couldn't call it a temple. Because he'd already promised the temple was going to be built in Zion, right? That was going to happen in Missouri. And so initially, he couldn't really call this a temple because he'd already promised the temple was going to be built there. So it was a house of God that was being built. But what he found was he couldn't generate very much excitement for building a house of prayer. And the funds were not coming in for that building project. And he was going to use it. It was supposed to be, they're going to have a school for the prophets there, where they taught LDS doctrine and trained young men. But he wasn't able to get a whole lot of excitement behind that. And so for several months, this building project kind of floundered and the funds weren't coming in. It wasn't until he had another revelation where he promised a great endowment that would take place in this building when it was built. And this is the first time we see in the history of the church them talking about what is very commonplace today, right? The endowments you receive in the temple. This is the first time that comes up. We have to build this temple because in this temple, God's going to give us these great endowments and His power is going to come upon us. So we had another revelation in June of 1833. I did this all week in preparing this. So if anything that says 83 in this should be 33. I'll just say that now. In June of that same year, God said, to you whom I love, I also chasten. Wherefore you must be chastened and stand rebuked before my face, for ye have sinned against me a very grievous sin, in that ye have not considered the great commandment in all things that I have given unto you concerning the building of my house. So God's getting onto them here. I told you back in January, right? And the funds aren't coming in. So now God is scolding them because you haven't been giving towards this project. Yea, verily I say unto you, I gave unto you a commandment that you should build a house, in which the house I designed to endow those whom I have chosen with power from on high. And eventually the funds begin to come in, and they begin this massive building project that would become eventually the Kirtland Temple. At the same time, Smith was also working on grand plans for the city of Kirtland itself. And in his plans, the city would eventually include 12 temples. And it's really hard to see on this image because the printing is so faded. But he laid out the whole city in these perfectly square blocks with really wide streets, with houses set back off of really wide streets, set back off the road, with a place for a garden for every house. But all of the barns and all the liveries had to be kept outside of town. These grand plans for the city that would eventually have 15 to 20,000 residents in his plan. That plan never came to pass in Kirtland, but his plans were so good that they were used by Brigham Young 14 years later in laying out the city of Salt Lake. Which you can see the original plots. He used the same thing with wide streets and square and lots. And it is amazing when you look at Brigham Young's plans overlaid with Salt Lake from above today, you can see how closely that they followed those. The interesting thing about Smith, though, is like a lot of visionaries, he was always able to see grand plans for the future. We've seen in recent weeks all of the grand things he said were going to happen in Zion, right, in Missouri, in his grand plans for the city that would be there and the temple that would be there, and his grand plans for Kirtland. He could always see these great and marvelous visions of the future, and the problem is none of the Zions he ever planned ever panned out. It's not going to work out in Missouri. It didn't work out in Kirtland. It didn't work out in Nauvoo when they end up there. He was great at big picture stuff, but he struggled a lot with stuff that was right in front of him and knowing what to do with decisions that had to be made. And unknown to Smith in this time, while he's making these grand plans for Kirtland, his community in Zion was doomed even as he spoke. In August of that year, Smith made public a revelation commanding his people in Missouri to do the same thing, to give a tithe of all their property, to start building the temple in Zion. And this is really important if you recall in past weeks. The temple's going to be built there, and that's going to usher in the return of Jesus, and that's going to usher in the millennium. So he says the time has come to get that building project started in Zion. This is the revelation in Doctrine and Covenants 97 in August of 1833, where God said, Verily I say unto you, it's my will that a house should be built unto me in the land of Zion, like unto the pattern I have given you. Let it be built speedily by the tithing of my people. Behold, this is the tithing and sacrifice which I, the Lord, require at your hands, that there may be a house built unto me for the salvation of Zion. Here's the unfortunate thing about this particular revelation. This is maybe the most poorly timed of all of Smith's revelations. Because when he said in August and sent word back to his followers in Missouri, start building the temple and give a tithe of your income to do it, what he didn't know, because of time and distance and how long it took news to travel, is everything had already fallen apart for the Mormons in Missouri 2 weeks before he ever gave this revelation. It wasn't possible for his people in Missouri to do this because they had lost everything by the time this revelation was given. They had nothing to give. And we're going to look at how that happened today. But I think it's significant to point out, and we've seen this several times, and this is the decision it leads us to. We've seen this over and over again, where God gives the revelation and that it doesn't come to pass. God gives them this revelation to give a tithe to build my house, and they've got nothing to give when the revelation is given. There's only two possibilities that leads you to. number one is God is wrong. Right? God told his people to tithe to build this house when they had nothing to give, and God was unaware of what was going on in Missouri at the time. Or Joseph Smith's not really hearing from God. And there's really no other option that I can see there. And this is far different, by the way, that, you know, if myself and the other pastors, we came before the church today and we said, we believe God is leading us to tear this building down and build a massive new $10 million structure here. And, you know, we tried to do that and our plans totally fell apart. We were just wrong, right? God was not leading in that, and we were mistaken. That's not an option here. Because Joseph Smith is saying, this is being given to me by revelation of God. God is the one saying this. I'm the mouthpiece. So the only options available are either God's unaware of what's going on in Missouri, or Smith is not really hearing from God. And we've seen this over and over again. And I just want you to keep that in mind as we see this pattern. And looking at these revelations chronologically, where over and over God says to do this, or this is going to happen, and it never happens. The only options available to us there are God's wrong, or Smith's not really speaking for God. And if he's not really speaking for God, he's not really a prophet. All right, so let's talk about Missouri a minute and how things all fell to pieces in Zion in a very brief period of time. It's kind of ironic that one of the worst periods of religious persecution in American history happened in a city named Independence. And I do want to say, I don't want to give the impression in all of these events we're going to talk about this morning that I'm siding with the old settlers. I want to just look at historically the mindset of the old settlers and how all of this came into place. But I think the Mormons were treated horribly wrong in all of this in America, in a place where we're supposed to have religious liberty, even with people with whom we completely disagree. And I do think the Mormon settlers were certainly not treated fairly and were harmed wrongly a great deal in all of this. We talked about the fact last week that Western Missouri was the edge of the frontier in 1833, and Independence was largely made up of people who were very rough and tumble and largely illiterate, not highly educated, very brave, very independent, but also very antisocial and not open to outsiders. And one traveling preacher who had gone through Western Missouri said that it was inhabited by a semi-barbarian population constantly pressing on the heels of the retreating savages. And if you know anything about Missouri during the Civil War, that was certainly true a few decades later still in Missouri during that time period. So on the evening of July 20th, 1833, several hundred Jackson County citizens gathered to talk about what they were going to do about the Mormon problem. They had gone in a couple years from 3 to over 1,200, and that number was going up every day. And their resolutions were published in the Western Monitor a couple weeks later. And I think it's worth taking, and bear with me here, I hope I'm not reading too much from the sources, but I think it's worth taking a minute to look at what was determined in this meeting, because it helps you see the mindset of the old settlers at the time and what led to their actions. So they met on the 20th of July, 1833. This group composed of gentlemen from every part of the county, there being present between 400 and 500 persons. That is a significant portion, especially when you consider this is all men at this meeting. So when you take into account their wives and kids, this represents a significant portion of the population of Jackson County at the time, at this meeting. It's a large group. Talking about the Mormon problem, they said, this is an evil no one could have foreseen and is therefore unprovided for by the laws, and the delays incident to legislation would put the evil beyond remedy. Oh, that's a nice way of saying we have no option but to take the law into our own hands. That the Mormon problem is so bad that we can't wait on the laws. And if we wait on legislation, it's going to be too late. We have to do something about it. A little more than 2 years ago, some 2 or 3 of these people made their appearance in the upper Missouri, and they now number upwards of 1,200 souls in this county. And each successive autumn and spring pours forth its swarms among us, with a gradual falling off in the character of those who compose them. So the people that are coming in, they're not the kind of citizens we want in our county. Until it seems that those communities from which they come were flooding us with the very dregs of their composition, elevated as they are, mostly are, but little above the condition of our blacks, our slaves. These Mormons are almost as bad as slaves. They're not the kind of citizens we want. Either in regard to property or education, they have become a subject of much anxiety on that part. And they are having even a corrupting influence on our slaves. So we got to do something about them. We're daily told, not by the ignorant alone, but by all classes of them, that we, the Gentiles of this county, are to be cut off, and our lands appropriated by them for inheritances. Whether this is to be accomplished by the hand of the destroying angel, the judgments of God, or the arm of power, they are not fully agreed among themselves. And I referenced that quote last week. Part of their insecurity and part of their fear is the Mormons have been telling them, all this land is going to be ours. And this is going to be Zion. And even if they were doing it in good faith to try to convert and evangelize the people of Jackson County, the message they've been preaching is, this is all going to be the land of Zion. This is all going to be ours, and you need to repent and get on board, or God's going to judge you, and you're going to be left out. And so they've been hearing that message consistently. They've been running it in the Evening and Morning Star paper, that this is all going to be ours one day. So you can see how that would lead them to a little bit of anxiety on their part as well. Some recent remarks in the Evening and Morning Star, and that's the LDS paper, by their tendency to moderate such hopes and repress such desires, show plainly that many of this deluded and infatuated people have been taught to believe that our lands were to be won from us by the sword. From this newspaper, we learn that for the want of more honest or commendable employment, many of their society are now preaching through the states of New York, Ohio, and Illinois, and that their numbers are increasing beyond all rational calculation, all of whom are required as soon as convenient to come to Zion, which is the name they have thought proper to confer to our little village. Right? So there's 1,200 of them, and they keep telling us there's bunches more coming. All right? They've got missionaries out preaching, and they're reaching lots of converts, and they're all coming. So they recognize that this problem is only going to get worse in terms of the normal people. It requires no gift of prophecy to tell that the day is not far distant when the civil government of the county will be in their hands. And here, that's the real issue, right? They realize if they keep coming, we are not going to have the votes in a short amount of time. The day is coming when the sheriff, the justices, and the county judges will be Mormons, or people who will court the Mormons and rule in their favor. So a big part of the issue is political, right? We're going to lose the votes if they keep flooding in the current pace that they are. And here's the other, I think, big issue. One of the means resorted to by them in order to drive us to immigrate, to make us leave, is an indirect invitation to the free brethren of color in Illinois to come up like the rest of us, come up like the rest to the land of Zion. So freed black slaves to come. The article, talking about an article in the paper, alluded to, contained an extract from our laws and all the necessary directions and cautions to be observed by colored brethren to enable them upon their arrival here to claim and exercise the rights of citizenship. And so the other big fear was, and remember, Missouri was a slave state, largely founded by slave owners. About 20% of the population of Missouri at this point in time was slaves. And so their other big fear was they are encouraging black people, freed black slaves, to immigrate here. And the negative effect that's going to have on our slaves. And Missouri law at the time required that any freed slave or any freed black person, in order to immigrate to Missouri, that they had to have a letter of citizenship from the state that they were immigrating to Missouri from in order to locate to Missouri. And Phelps had published an article in the Star where he was trying, and he knew this was a powder keg issue, and he was trying to encourage these freed slaves, and it was a handful, it was like 3 or 4 that had converted to Mormonism, to come, but to follow the laws. But that was totally misconstrued, and it got out of hand, and he tried to backtrack on it, by then it was too late, and everybody had become convinced that, you know, all of the racists in the areas, that the church was just wanting droves of black people to come in, slave or not. And so that was very concerning to most of the residents. And so really those two issues, the politics of it and the slavery issue, really got them worked up. The end result of this meeting is that they drew up a list of 5 demands that they presented to the Mormon settlers. That no Mormons settle in Jackson County in the future. That nobody else can come in. That the people who have already settled here, that you agree to sell your land and get out by next spring. This was in July. You sell your property and you leave, and that you immediately close your press, so that you immediately stop printing the Millennial Star, which you got to remember, in that day, we talk about the power of the press today, but that was all there was then, right? There was no CNN, there was no Fox News, there was no internet. You stop printing the Millennial Star now, and you close the storehouse immediately, which would have been a huge problem for the Mormons because they're trying to live communally out of the storehouse, right? Then number 4, that you cease all immigration from people coming from Ohio. And then their 5th demand was really just a veiled threat, a sarcastic veiled threat. That all of those who fail to comply with these requisitions be referred to those of their brethren who have the gift of divination to inform them of that lot that awaits them. And if you don't comply with these demands, you just ask the people among you who say they can see the future and let them tell you what's going to happen if you don't follow through. At the end of that meeting, the mob got themselves all worked up, and so this huge mob descends on the offices of the Evening and Morning Star. They destroy the printing press. They tear down the building. Edward Partridge, who was the bishop, who was in charge of everything, he was given exactly 15 minutes to comply with that list of demands. Eventually, at the end of the night, they destroyed the building, everything. The Book of Commandments was hot off the presses. They destroyed every copy of it that they could get their hands on. They drug Edward Partridge and another man named Charles Allen out in the street, and they tarred and feathered them. They mixed the tar with acid so that if they didn't get it off, it would eat at your skin. And Edward Partridge, by all accounts, handled it better than I would have. That the saints who saw him afterwards in his home, where they're trying to scrape all of that off of him before it eats up his skin, that he said, I don't hold any animosity, I don't hold any ill will towards the people who did this. So things start falling apart. 3 days later, another mob reassembles. They charge the Mormon settlement in one part of the county with daggers and with rifles. Church leaders on that particular night were threatened with 100 lashes, which that's essentially a death sentence, right? You're not going to survive 100 lashes. They threatened to burn all of the Mormon crops and cabins. And so under this pressure, the leaders promised to leave by January 1st. We'll leave, and everybody else will follow just as soon as they can. It took a while for all of this to get back to Smith. Remember, there's 800 miles separating them. And you remember, this is the same time all of this happened before he gave the prophecy saying, start building the temple. At the same time, literally everything's falling apart in Missouri while he's given this revelation. Of course, he was appalled when Cowdery brought him word from Missouri. And he gave an immediate revelation commanding the people to renounce war. And he was initially, he was consistent in saying, we're not going to fight violence with violence. And I admire him for that. And he does follow the teaching, I think, of Jesus, where when specifically attacked for our faith, I don't believe we should retaliate as followers of Jesus. So, Doctrine and Covenants 98 in August, as soon as he heard of it, he said, God says, renounce war, proclaim peace, seek diligently to turn the hearts of the children to their fathers. And I speak to you concerning your families. If men smite you or your families once, and you bear it patiently, and revile not, neither seek revenge, you will have your reward. And if they smite you a second time, and you revile not against your enemy, your reward shall be 100-fold. And if they smite you a third time, and you bear it patiently, your reward will be doubled unto you 4-fold. So don't fight back, was his only encouragement. Officially, the only thing he did was to send 2 men to petition the governor to do something about it. Unofficially, Smith said that the saints in Missouri had brought it all upon themselves. Let me show you kind of how that happened with a side story of a very interesting lady named Vienna Jacquez. And this picture of her she lived to be 100. So this was taken way later in her life. But she was a convert who had come to faith in Boston, and she had been a big asset to missionaries that Smith had sent to Boston and housed them and everything there. She eventually moved to Kirtland, and almost immediately upon arriving in Kirtland, she was given a revelation from God to move to Zion and sell everything she had and give it to the church and go to Zion. And here's the revelation that God gave her through Joseph Smith in March of 1833. God said, again, verily I say unto you, it is my will that my handmaid, Vienna Jacquez, should receive money to bear her expenses and go up into the land of Zion, and the residue of the money may be consecrated unto me, and she be rewarded in my own due time. So in other words, she's to give everything to the church, and we'll give her enough from the storehouse to relocate to Zion. Verily I say unto you that it is meet in mine eyes that she should go unto the land of Zion, and receive an inheritance from the hand of the bishop, that she may settle down in peace, inasmuch as she is faithful, and not be idle in her days from henceforth. So, give everything you got, go to Missouri. And she did. It's interesting, she is one of only 2 women mentioned by name in all of Doctrine and Covenants and all of the revelations and commands that were given. The other is Emma Smith, who you might recall several weeks ago was told by God to straighten up and get on board. The only other one is, the other woman mentioned is this woman, Vienna Jacquez. And if I can read between the lines, this is the same time period that they're struggling to get that temple project off the ground in Kirtland. $42,000 in 1833 went a long way. And it was largely her gift that was able to get that project of building the temple started in Kirtland. So reading between the lines, I don't mean to sound, I can't think of the right word, but it's interesting. I think Smith found out she had money. And all of a sudden there's a revelation commanding her to give money and go to Zion. And she faithfully did it. She gave $1,400 and moved to Missouri, but not long after she got there, that's when things fell apart. And so she wrote to Smith for explanation going, what the world? Right? I just gave pretty much all the money I had to the church. I've relocated to Missouri and it's fallen apart here. And he wrote her a letter back in September of 1833. After all of this had gone down, here's the handwritten note from Smith himself, where he writes this to her. He says, I was sensible when you left Kirtland that the Lord would chasten you. But I prayed fervently in the name of Jesus that you might live to receive your inheritance, agreeable to the commandment which was given. I'm not all astonished at what has happened to you, neither to what has happened to Zion. And I could tell you all the whys and the wherefores of all of their calamities, but alas, it is vain to warn and give precepts. For all men are naturally disposed to walk in their own paths, as they are pointed out by their own fingers, and are not willing to consider and walk in the path which is pointed out by another, saying, "This is the way, walk ye in it, although he should be an unerring director, and the Lord God sent him." I don't know if you caught that, but he basically says, I'm not surprised this happened, but if they would have just listened to me, the unerring director, none of this would have gone down. So basically, it's all their fault. This same time period in October, Smith and Rigdon left on a preaching tour through Canada and all around the East, which I think is very interesting timing. I think he knew he couldn't do anything for the saints in Missouri, and if he'd showed up there, it probably would have just made it worse. But at the same time, he didn't want to stay in Kirtland and have to answer to the people on why aren't you doing something about what's going on in Missouri. So he and Rigdon got out of town for a while, just to wait for things to die down and to let it play out and see what would happen. He did advise those in the greatest danger in Missouri to leave Jackson County and told everybody else to hang on and wait till things just start to cool down. Problem was, things didn't cool down. Back in Missouri, the saints had petitioned the governor, saying, send some troops down here to maintain order. Things are getting out of hand. On October 31st, 50 men attacked the colony in the area Big Blue River, where they went in, they demolished cabins, they whipped and stoned all of the men, and they drove all the women and children into the woods. So basically driving them out of town, leaving them homeless, tear down their house and literally force them out. Similar raids occurred in other Mormon communities several nights in a row, and so the Mormons finally began to raise their own militia just to defend their homes and defend their property. And it's hard to blame them for doing so at this point in time. And then kind of where things really blew up, in November, David Whitmer and a group of Mormon militia were out patrolling, and they got into a clash with some old settlers, and 2 non-Mormons and 1 Mormon were killed in that battle. And it blew up in the press. It got exaggerated a lot in the press, and that got both sides riled up at that point. And it looked like, war was inevitable. It's interesting that the lieutenant governor at the time, it's a man, Liburn Boggs, he called out the state militia. It's interesting that he was a resident of Independence. He was also one of the largest landholders in the Independence area. So do you think he's completely without bias on this issue? Probably not. And he calls out the militia to restore order, but he appointed over the militia Colonel Thomas Pitcher, and Pitcher was one of the signers of the manifesto that we looked at earlier. And that whole mob who had sworn, I didn't show you, but they had all sworn we're going to rid this land of the Mormons even at the cost of our own lives. That's the guy you put over the militia. You think they're going to get a fair shake from him? Probably not. So hearing some of the Mormons had been in prison during this time, some of the leaders, and hearing that they were about to be executed, the Mormons gathered their forces in Western Independence. Colonel Pitcher demanded his forces, and they go out to meet him, and he demands that they lay down their arms, and they begin negotiating. And Lieutenant Governor Boggs, acting like he was acting in good faith, urged them to obey, and he promised the Mormon militia that if you lay down your arms, Pitcher will lay down his arms. They didn't want to do it, but they eventually conceded, and all of the Mormons laid down their arms. All of their weapons were taken from them. When Boggs asked Pitcher to lay down his arms, and asked in quotation marks, it said that Pitcher just responded by smiling in his beard, was the quote. But basically it was wink, wink, yeah, right. Pitcher didn't lay down his arms. So that left his forces armed, the Mormons completely unarmed at that point. And things obviously didn't go well from there. That same night, a mob systematically sacked every Mormon community. They beat and whipped the men. They drove the women and children out like cattle. By morning, 1,200 people had been driven from their homes and into the woods. Those who were able and had the means to do so fled to Clay County, which is the county just north of Jackson, where they were initially received and they were sheltered. But the vast majority of them were left. This is November in Missouri. It ain't as harsh as Utah, but it's not real warm either. That left them huddled in the woods in a bog with no homes and whatever possessions they could grab on their way out in trying to survive. So here you have this whole Mormon community basically living huddled, hiding in the woods like refugees in November in Missouri. It took a month for this news to reach Smith back in Independence, 800 miles. News travel slow. But he got an account from Phelps, who was the publisher of the paper, and Hyde, one of the leaders. About the same time, he got an account from them, and he also received word from another courier that Mormons had killed more than 20 Missourians, and so the accounts were kind of conflicting. Phelps and Hyde's accounts were fairly accurate, but he also had these other reports coming in, and so he was left not exactly knowing what in the world is going on. And so his reply to his people was not really what they had wanted to hear at this point. And you would expect, based on everything else Smith had said to this point, right? This is going to be your land, and God's going to give it to you, and God's going to smite your enemies, right? And they're going to fall before you. All those previous revelations we had seen. You'd think if Smith was confident in those, his reply would have been, hang on, a mighty smiting is getting ready to come from God any day now. But at the same time, I think Smith is he's learning to be a little more political in the way that he talks, and he's learning, I think he knows there's not going to be any smiting coming from God any time soon. And so he's trying to handle things diplomatically. Anyway, his response is not what they wanted to hear. He responded on December 5th, saying, "Dear brethren, we have just received a letter from Brother Phelps dated the 6th and 7th of November, which gives us the painful intelligence of the rage of the enemy and your present unsettled situation. But I must inform you that there is a great dubiety resting upon our minds with regard to the true state of affairs in Zion." In other words, we don't really understand what's going on there. It appears that the above statements were mostly from reports, and there's no certainty of their being correct. Therefore, it's difficult for us to advise. We can only say that the destinies of our people are in the hands of God. I would inform you that it's not the will of the Lord for you to sell your lands in Zion. Hang on to it, if means can possibly be procured for their sustenance without. Every exertion should be made to maintain the cause that you have espoused and to contribute to the necessities of one another. This would sting a little bit, and I get what he's saying. You are not yet brought into as trying circumstances as were the ancient prophets and apostles. Things ain't really that bad, right? You haven't suffered like Peter. I know you're living homeless in the woods, but you haven't suffered like them yet, so hang in there. You will recollect that the Lord has said that Zion should not be removed out of her place, so he's holding on to that. Therefore, the land should not be sold, but be held by the saints until the Lord in his wisdom opens a way for your return. It's not safe for us to send you a written revelation on the subject, but what is written above is according to wisdom. I don't have any revelation for you right now. It's not safe for me to give one. This was on December 5th. 11 days later, that revelation that they were waiting for did come. And this is what Smith revealed from the hand of God on December 16th, explaining the difficulty that the saints were going through. I, the Lord, have suffered the affliction to come upon them, wherewith they have been afflicted in consequence of their transgressions. Behold, I say unto you, there were jarrings and contentions and envyings and strifes and lustful and covetous desires among them. Therefore, by these things they polluted their inheritance. It's your fault. God's judging you, right? You're being judged. Your inheritance in Zion became polluted by all of your sin. And that's why this has happened. Which stung a great deal for the faithful Mormons who had been trying to hang in there and who are still wrestling with, where is our prophet? In all of this, we're going through all of this, where is Smith? And even really faithful men like Phelps, who is the publisher of the paper, who's had his printing press destroyed, even the faithful began to question, and this is what Phelps wrote back. Phelps said, I know it's right that we should be driven out of the land of Zion, that the rebellious might be sent away. I'm not questioning the revelation. God's doing this to deal with the rebellious among us. But brethren, if the Lord will, I should like to know what the honest in heart shall do. What about those of us who are not being rebellious and who are not being sinful? Our clothes are worn out. We want the necessities of life. And shall we lease, buy, or otherwise obtain land where we are to till what we may raise, so we have something to eat? Such is the common language of the honest, for they want the will of God to be done. You can hear his heart in that, can't you? Going, I get it. Okay, the wicked among us, they had to be punished. But what about those of us who are trying our darndest to be faithful? What are we supposed to do? And that's where we leave the church at the end of 1833 as it comes to a close. Next week, we get to talk about one of my absolute, it's so fascinating. If you're not familiar with Zion's camp, Smith said consistently, don't fight back, don't fight back, don't fight back, don't fight back, until 1834, in which he says, we're going to fight back, and we're going to raise an army, and we're going to go take Zion. And that army was Zion's camp. And the story of Zion's camp is just fascinating. And so we will get to that next week and see what happens in Zion as Smith raises his army to go reclaim Zion. For now, let's pray, and I'll be around if you have any questions.